The clash at Thermopylae has become one of the most enduring legends in world history, a story told and retold as the ultimate symbol of courage against overwhelming force. Yet, the famous stand of the 300 Spartans was not an isolated event. It was the culmination of decades of tension, humiliation, ambition, and a clash of two very different civilizations. To understand how a handful of Greek warriors stood against the might of the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, we must first journey back to an earlier time, 10 years before the battle itself. In 490 BC, on the plains of Marathon, the balance of power in the Mediterranean was shaken. The Persians, under King Darius the Great, had launched their first attempt to bring Greece under their control. Athens, small and inexperienced compared to the colossal Persian Empire, was expected to be crushed. Instead, the Athenian-led army pulled off a shocking victory. Against all odds, the Persians were routed, and their soldiers were driven back to their ships in chaos, forced to retreat across the Aegean Sea. For Darius, ruler of an empire stretching from Egypt to India, this defeat was an intolerable humiliation. He had sought to punish Athens for supporting a rebellion in Ionia, but instead his own prestige and the image of Persian invincibility had been tarnished. The defeat at Marathon was not just a military setback, it was a personal insult. Darius vowed to return, to wipe Athens from the map, and to reassert Persian dominance. But before he could make good on that vow, death overtook him. The task of avenging Persia's honor and fulfilling his father's dream passed to his son, Xerxes I. Xerxes was a man of towering ambition. Unlike his father, he saw himself not merely as a king, but as a ruler ordained by the gods themselves. He was determined not only to punish Athens, but to subdue the entire Greek world and absorb it into his empire. This was not simply a war of retaliation, it was a war of destiny. For 4 long years, Xerxes gathered the greatest military force the world had ever known. From the farthest reaches of his empire, soldiers were conscripted. Warriors came from Mesopotamia, Egypt, Bactria, and even as far as India, representing the staggering diversity of the Persian realm. Ancient sources, like the historian Herodotus, claimed Xerxes commanded millions, though modern scholars believe the true number was likely between 70,000 and 300,000 men, still an almost unimaginable force for the time. Supporting them was a naval fleet of over 1,200 warships, ready to dominate the seas. To enable this colossal invasion, Xerxes commanded feats of engineering that astonished the ancient world. He ordered a canal cut through the Athos Peninsula, allowing his fleet to bypass dangerous waters. Even more audaciously, he ordered the construction of 2 pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, the straits separating Asia from Europe. This engineering marvel, made of ships lashed together and anchored by massive cables, allowed his vast army to march directly from Asia into Europe. When storms destroyed his first attempt, Xerxes reportedly flew into a rage so immense that he ordered the waters of the Hellespont to be whipped and branded, punishing the sea itself as though it were a rebellious subject. The engineers responsible were executed and the bridges rebuilt. This story, whether exaggerated or not, perfectly illustrates the absolute power Xerxes wielded and the terrifying sense of divine authority he projected. As this mighty force advanced, fear swept across Greece. Many northern city-states, facing certain destruction, chose submission and pledged loyalty to Persia. After all, Greece was not a unified country, but a patchwork of fiercely independent city-states, often hostile to one another. But now, with the threat of annihilation looming, they were faced with a stark choice: surrender and live under Persian rule, or stand together and fight for their freedom. Out of this crisis, a fragile alliance was born. For leadership of their land forces, the Greeks turned to the one city-state that all acknowledged as the supreme military power of Greece, Sparta. To grasp the importance of Sparta's role, one must understand just how unique this city-state was. While Athens was exploring new frontiers in democracy, philosophy, and art, Sparta pursued a single obsession: war. Every aspect of Spartan life was designed to produce soldiers of unmatched discipline and skill. From the moment a child was born, his fate was decided by the state. Newborns were inspected by elders, and if they were found weak or deformed, they were left to die on a mountainside. Only the strong were allowed to survive. At the age of 7, Spartan boys entered the Agoge, the infamous state-run training program that defined their lives. For more than a decade, these children were hardened by relentless drills and brutal discipline. While they learned to read and write, their education was primarily centered on endurance, survival, and combat. They lived in barracks away from their families, deliberately underfed to encourage resourcefulness. They were expected to steal food, but if caught, the punishment was severe, not for the act itself, but for the failure to escape detection. The lessons were clear. Cunning, discipline, and silence in the face of suffering were essential virtues. The Agoge produced men capable of withstanding extraordinary pain without flinching, men who could obey any command without hesitation, and men who considered the needs of the state higher than their own lives. They trained constantly in the art of war, learning to fight as one in the phalanx, the fearsome shield and spear formation that dominated ancient battlefields. Spartan culture revered courage above all else. To show cowardice was to suffer a fate worse than death, social exile, shame, and dishonor. In contrast, bravery on the battlefield ensured eternal glory. Even women in Sparta were unlike those in the rest of Greece. They were educated, physically trained, and enjoyed freedoms unknown to their Athenian counterparts. Their duty was no less vital: to give birth to and raise strong sons who would become warriors of Sparta. This was the society that would send 300 of its finest soldiers to Thermopylae, a society forged in the fires of discipline and war, ready to stand against the vast empire of Persia. The Spartans, alongside their Greek allies, would face Xerxes and his unstoppable army at the Hot Gates, a narrow mountain pass where the fate of Greece would hang in the balance. The Spartans were raised with a saying that became legendary across the Greek world. Mothers would tell their sons to return from battle either with their shield or on it. It was a phrase that carried a brutal truth. To return with your shield meant you had fought bravely and survived. To be carried home on it meant you had died honorably in battle. But to return without it meant only one thing: you had thrown your shield away to run, an unforgivable act of cowardice in Sparta. This uncompromising code of honor forged warriors unlike any other. It produced King Leonidas and his famous 300 bodyguards. These men were not simply soldiers. They were the product of the Agoge, the harsh training system that stripped away weakness and shaped boys into hardened warriors. By the time Xerxes, the Persian king, marched a vast army into Greece, these Spartans were already legends in the making. The Persian threat was unlike anything Greece had faced before. Xerxes' army was so enormous that ancient writers described it as blotting out rivers as it drank from them. To face such a force, the Hellenic League, a fragile alliance of Greek city-states, needed a strategy that would neutralize Persia's overwhelming advantage in numbers. The Athenian general Themistocles, a man of extraordinary cunning, devised a two-pronged plan. On land, the Persians would be stopped at a narrow mountain pass where their numbers would count for little. At sea, the Persian navy would be trapped in a strait, unable to flank the Greek defenders or supply their vast host. The chosen ground for the land defense was a place called Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, named after its sulfur springs. In 480 BC, the pass was a bottleneck, only about 100 meters wide at points, with steep mountains on one side and the sea on the other. It was the perfect place for a small, disciplined force to resist an empire. The duty of holding the Hot Gates fell to King Leonidas of Sparta. Yet there was a complication. The invasion came at the same time as two sacred festivals, the Olympic Games and Sparta's own festival of the Carnia. Spartan law forbade full military campaigns during these religious celebrations. The Spartan council faced a terrible dilemma: either violate sacred tradition or risk leaving Greece undefended. In the end, a compromise was reached. Leonidas could not take the full Spartan army, but he was permitted to march immediately with his personal guard of 300 men. These were no ordinary troops. Each was an experienced veteran, handpicked by Leonidas himself. According to Herodotus, he chose men who already had sons, ensuring their bloodlines would survive even if they did not. It was a grim selection, almost an acknowledgement that this mission might well be a death sentence. Before he marched, Leonidas consulted the oracle at Delphi, the most revered prophetic voice in the Greek world. The oracle's words were both ominous and precise. Either Sparta would be destroyed, or a Spartan king of Heracles' bloodline must die to save it. For Leonidas, there was no question what had to be done. A Spartan king's duty was to sacrifice himself if necessary for the survival of his people. With this knowledge weighing heavily on him, he led his 300 north, gathering allies as he advanced. By the time they reached Thermopylae, the Greek force had swelled to roughly 7,000 men, including contingents from Thespiae, Thebes, and other cities. Though still vastly outnumbered, they were determined to hold the pass. At Thermopylae, the Greeks immediately strengthened their position. They repaired an old defensive wall, known as the Phocian Wall, that blocked the narrowest part of the pass, and stationed their troops behind it. At the heart of the army stood the hoplites, the heavily armored infantry of Greece. A hoplite was essentially a human tank. He wore a bronze cuirass to shield his torso, bronze greaves for his legs, and the famous Corinthian helmet that enclosed his entire head, leaving only slits for eyes. His primary weapon was the dory, a long, thrusting spear. For close combat, he carried a short sword called the xiphos. Yet his most vital piece of equipment was the hoplon, the great round shield made of wood and bronze. In formation, these shields overlapped to form an impenetrable wall. This phalanx formation, with ranks of spears projecting forward, was a nearly unbreakable defensive system, especially in confined terrain where the enemy could not maneuver around it. When Xerxes finally arrived, his army stretched as far as the eye could see. Ancient accounts spoke of a force numbering in the hundreds of thousands, though modern historians believe the figure was likely smaller. Still, the Persian host dwarfed the Greek defenders. Confident of an easy victory, Xerxes set up a throne overlooking the pass, expecting his enemies to collapse at the mere sight of his power. For 4 days, he did nothing but wait, assuming the Greeks would surrender or retreat. Finally, he sent a messenger demanding their submission. Leonidas' response was as brief as it was defiant. "Molenlabe, come and take them." The Spartans, far from being cowed, carried on with calm rituals. They oiled their bodies, combed their long hair, and exercised customs they observed before a battle in which they might face death. Xerxes, infuriated by their defiance, finally ordered an attack on the 5th day. The first assault began with clouds of arrows that darkened the sky. Herodotus recorded that one Spartan joked, "Good, then we shall fight in the shade." Raising their hoplons, the Greeks deflected the storm of missiles with ease. Frustrated, Xerxes unleashed his infantry. 10,000 Persians surged forward, their wicker shields and shorter spears no match for the wall of bronze. The Greeks held their ground, cutting the enemy down methodically. The narrowness of the pass worked entirely in their favor. As Persian soldiers fell, those behind them pressed forward, only to be trampled in the chaos. The result was carnage. Xerxes threw wave after wave at the phalanx, but it held firm. By nightfall, thousands of Persians were dead, while Greek losses were negligible. Enraged by the humiliation, Xerxes decided to deploy his elite, the Immortals, 10,000 hand-picked warriors whose ranks were always kept full to give the impression of invincibility. Gleaming in their armor, they advanced with discipline and confidence. Yet even the Immortals could not break the Greek wall. The Spartans and their allies employed a cunning tactic, feigning retreat only to turn suddenly and reform their ranks, catching the Persians off guard and cutting them down in brutal counterattacks. Watching from his throne, Xerxes was said to have leapt to his feet 3 times in fury as his finest soldiers were slaughtered before his eyes. By the end of the second day, the Persians had suffered catastrophic losses, while the Greek line remained unbroken. 7,000 defenders had held back a vast empire. For 2 days, Leonidas' strategy had worked flawlessly, proving that discipline, courage, and terrain could defy even impossible odds. But as night fell, a betrayal was about to change everything and seal the fate of Leonidas and his 300. As the exhausted Greek defenders took what little rest they could at Thermopylae, a shadow fell across their fragile hope. From among the locals, a man stepped forward whose name would forever be etched into history as the embodiment of betrayal. His name was Ephialtes. Unlike the warriors who stood at the pass, Ephialtes was no hero. He was an opportunist, a man driven not by loyalty or honor, but by greed. He knew these mountains better than anyone alive, every path and every hidden trail that wound between the ridges and ravines. And when the Persian king Xerxes promised him wealth and reward in exchange for information, Ephialtes revealed the one thing that could undo the heroic stand of Leonidas and his men. He told them of a narrow track, the Annihilate path, a trail that curved behind the hot gates and would allow the Persians to outflank the Greek position entirely. This was not a secret unknown to Leonidas. The Spartan king had anticipated such a risk. To guard against it, he had stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the slopes of the mountain to hold the trail should the Persians attempt to use it. Yet foresight is worthless when treachery clears the way. Xerxes wasted no time. Seizing on the opportunity, he sent his general Hydarnes and the elite corps of his army, the Immortals, into the mountains under the cloak of night. Through the long, dark hours they marched, guided by Ephialtes. At dawn, they came upon the Phocian defenders. Herodotus, the ancient historian, recounts that the first warning the Greeks had of the Persian approach was the sound of leaves rustling under thousands of advancing feet. The Persians loosed volleys of arrows, and in the chaos, the Phocians fell back. They believed they were the primary target of the attack and tried to reposition themselves defensively. But this was a tragic misunderstanding. Hydarnes had no interest in them. His only goal was to push forward, to take the path and cut off the Spartan king from behind. A desperate messenger raced down the mountain to bring Leonidas the grim truth. The Persians were now behind them. The Greek position was no longer defensible. The narrow pass had become a trap. Leonidas called a war council. The allied commanders gathered, and the situation was clear. They faced annihilation. Most urged immediate retreat to preserve their forces so they could regroup and fight another day. Leonidas agreed. This had never been a battle meant to end in victory. The entire purpose of Thermopylae was to delay the Persian advance, to hold the pass long enough that the rest of Greece could prepare. For more than 2 days, they had done exactly that, making Xerxes pay in blood for every step his men took. The sacrifice had already achieved its purpose. Now the majority of the Greek forces were dismissed and ordered to withdraw. But Leonidas himself did not leave. For a Spartan king, retreat was not only dishonorable, it was impossible. He was bound by the iron laws of his homeland and by the words of the Oracle of Delphi, which had foretold that either Sparta would be destroyed or one of her kings would fall. Leonidas knew his fate, and he embraced it. He would remain to fight to the death, standing as the final shield between the Persian horde and his fleeing allies. His 300 Spartan warriors, bound by their own code and by devotion to their king, chose to remain with him. Yet they were not alone in their resolve. 700 Thespians, under the command of Demophilus, made the astonishing decision to stay as well. They could have left. They could have preserved their lives. But they chose death beside the Spartans, preferring honor and sacrifice over survival. Their bravery, though less remembered, was every bit as extraordinary. The Thebans who also stood with Leonidas did not share that same devotion. Ancient accounts suggest that most surrendered or were forced to remain against their will. In all, around 1,500 men now prepared to meet the full might of Xerxes' army. Knowing what awaited them, Leonidas addressed his men one last time. He is said to have told them to eat a strong breakfast because by nightfall they would dine in the underworld. It was both grim and resolute, a reminder that their deaths were certain, but also that they would meet it as warriors. When the Persians advanced for the final assault, the defenders did not wait behind their walls. Instead, they surged forward into the broader part of the pass, determined to take as many enemies with them as possible. What followed was no ordinary battle. It was fury, chaos, and desperation bound together into one final act of defiance. When the Spartans' spears splintered, they drew their swords. When their swords broke, they fought with daggers, with their hands, even with their teeth. They killed until they could kill no more. Leonidas himself fell in the thick of the fighting, and his death ignited a savage struggle. Both sides fought bitterly over his body, the Spartans and Thespians desperate to recover their king, the Persians determined to seize him. Eventually, sheer numbers overwhelmed the defenders. Pushed back, the Greeks retreated to a small hill near the pass. Surrounded on all sides, they gathered together for a final stand. The Persians closed in, and at last, a storm of arrows rained down. The last defenders were buried in the black cloud of missiles. When the dust cleared, nearly every Spartan and Thespian lay dead. Thermopylae had fallen. The hot gates, once a wall against the invasion, now lay open. Xerxes marched south. He burned the abandoned city of Athens. And in a shocking act of cruelty that appalled even the standards of his own age, he ordered the body of Leonidas to be decapitated and crucified. On the surface, the Persians had triumphed. Yet the truth was far different. The sacrifice at Thermopylae had not been meaningless. The 3-day delay had given the Greek allies precious time to rally their defenses. Soon after, at the naval battle of Salamis, Themistocles lured the massive Persian fleet into narrow straits where their numbers counted for nothing. There, the Greeks won a victory so decisive it shattered Persian naval power. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, the united Greek armies crushed the Persian land forces and ended Xerxes' invasion once and for all. But the story of Thermopylae is not remembered merely for its strategic outcome. Its power lies in what it symbolized. Almost immediately, it became legend, a rallying cry for Greek unity and courage. It was retold in poems and songs, etched into memory as proof that a small band of warriors could defy the largest army the world had ever seen. A monument was raised to honor Leonidas, and the poet Simonides wrote an epitaph so enduring that it still moves hearts today. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. For more than 2 millennia, the stand of the 300 Spartans and their allies has inspired soldiers, leaders, artists, and dreamers. It has been retold in countless forms, from ancient verses to modern novels, plays, and films. Though dramatized and reshaped across the centuries, the essence of the story remains unshaken. Thermopylae is proof that history is not only written by victors. It is also shaped by those who resist to the very end, even in defeat. Some sacrifices are so absolute, so meaningful, that they achieve immortality. The sacrifice at the Hot Gates was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. It lit a fire in the Greek people, a fire that fueled their resistance, a fire that helped preserve their culture. And that culture, with its ideas of democracy, philosophy, and freedom, became the foundation of Western civilization itself. The echoes of Thermopylae reach across centuries, reminding us of the power of courage, the meaning of sacrifice, and the timeless truth that sometimes the most glorious victories are born from the ashes of defeat.